Jean was exhausted from working overtime for the week. She was an event planner who had to work through the night, finalizing preparations for a major company launch. As she trudged into her apartment complex, all she could think about was collapsing into bed. But as she approached her apartment block, she saw someone in the elevator. It was the old lady who lived in the apartment next door. She was always there, but Jean never had much interaction with her. The old lady would sit in the common area and read a book, occasionally waving at Jean when she passed by. Jean never stopped to talk, always feeling like she had to hurry to her work or other engagements. But tonight was different. The old lady was standing in the elevator, and her expression was cold and menacing. Her eyes seemed to pierce through Jean's soul, and her ghostly appearance sent shivers down Jean's spine. Jean purposely slowed down her pace as she approached the elevator, hoping to avoid sharing it with the old lady. She breathed a sigh of relief as she watched the elevator doors slowly close, finally separating her from the old lady. As the elevator reached Jean's floor, she walked past the old lady's apartment and was relieved not to see her again. She quickly unlocked her own door and stepped into her apartment. Feeling exhausted, Jean headed straight for the bathroom and took a quick shower, before changing into her pajamas. She didn't dwell on the strange encounters with the old lady and quickly fell asleep. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of her encounters with the old lady next door. The next day was another busy day at work for Jean. With the launch fast approaching, there were so many things that demanded her attention. She worked tirelessly throughout the day, and by the time she finished, it was already 11 p.m. at night when she finally arrived at her apartment block. While approaching the elevator, Jean saw the old lady again. This time round, she was standing in the hallway, her back turned towards Jean, as if she was waiting for her to come home. This made Jean feel uneasy, as it was unusual for the old lady to wait up for her. As Jean got closer, the old lady turned and slowly walked towards the elevator. Jean followed her and pressed the button, trying to be polite. The elevator arrived, and they both stepped inside. Jean then pressed the button for their floor. As the doors closed, Jean couldn't help but feel like something was off. The old lady was eerily quiet, just staring at the elevator doors. She didn't say a word, and neither did Jean. It was as if the air between them was thick and heavy. Jean also noticed that the old lady's hair was disheveled, and her clothes were torn and dirty, as if she had been through a struggle. Finally, the elevator doors opened. Without looking back, Jean shuffled out of the elevator and down the hall to her apartment. As she opened the door, Jean breathed a sigh of relief. She was finally home. However, she couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling she had. It was almost as if she was being watched. Jean changed into her pajamas and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded her. She kept replaying the elevator ride in her head, trying to make sense of what felt off. But eventually, exhaustion took over and she drifted off into an uneasy slumber. On the third night when Jean returned to the apartment block, the old lady was nowhere to be seen. She breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. As the elevator started moving, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Suddenly, the elevator lights began to flicker. She had a feeling that someone was staring at her from behind, causing her to slowly turn around. What she saw made her gasp in horror. The old lady was standing behind her, silently staring at her with hollow eyes. Jean felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The old lady didn't say a word, but her gaze was enough to send shivers down Jean's spine. Jean noticed that the old lady is still wearing the same dirty and torn clothes from yesterday. Jean's fingers shook as she attempted to press every button on the elevator. The buttons were unresponsive, and the elevator continued to move upward. Fear crept into her body as she felt a cold breath on the nape of her neck. Her heart raced with terror and anxiety, and she could feel the old lady's presence close to her. Suddenly, she heard a whisper. Jean bolted the moment the elevator doors opened without looking back. As she turned to her apartment hall, she was paralyzed with shock. The old lady was standing right outside her own apartment, which was next to Jean's. She stood frozen at her spot, not daring to make a move. The old lady turned her head slowly and gazed at Jean as if she was trying to convey a message. Then, to Jean's astonishment, the old lady started to disappear through the door, passing through it as if it was not there. Jean stood there, her eyes wide with shock, unable to move. After what felt like an eternity, Jean turned and ran down the stairs instead of returning to her apartment. She could not bring herself to stay there for another moment. When she finally reached the ground floor, she immediately called her best friend and asked to stay over at her place for the night. Jean spent a restless night at her best friend's place, her mind racing with thoughts of the old lady's ghostly encounter. She had never believed in ghosts before, but after what she had experienced, she couldn't deny their existence. She did not share her experience with her best friend, not wanting to scare her. The next day, Jean decided to visit the old lady's apartment to try and make sense of what had happened. As she walked down the hallway, she could smell a foul odor emanating from the old lady's apartment. It was clear that something was not right. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She tried the handle, and to her surprise, it was unlocked. She cautiously pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sight that greeted her made her feel sick to her stomach. The apartment was in complete disarray, with garbage and food waste strewn all over the floor. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the smell was overpowering. As Jean's eyes fell upon the body of the old lady, she was met with a sight that made her stomach churn. The body was lying on the floor, covered in cadaverine, but the putrid smell emanating from it was overwhelming. The stench of death and decomposition filled the air, making it hard for Jean to breathe. The old lady's body was in a state of advanced decay, and it was clear that she had been there for several days. The once rosy complexion of her skin had turned a sickly shade of gray, and her flesh had begun to break down, revealing the bones and tendons beneath. Maggots and flies buzzed around her body, feasting on the remains. The smell was so pungent that it made Jean's eyes water and her throat constrict. She had never experienced anything like this before, and the sight of the old lady's decomposed body was etched into her memory forever. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that the old lady had died alone, with no one to care for her. Jean struggled to walk out of the old lady's apartment, her knees still weak from the horrible sight. She knew she had to call the police immediately. She fumbled with her phone and dialed the emergency number, her hands shaking with fear and shock. "Hello? What is your emergency?" The operator's voice came through the phone. "There's a body in my neighbor's apartment," Jean stuttered. "I think she's been dead for days. Please send someone quickly." The operator asked for her name and address before assuring her that help was on the way. Jean hung up the phone and leaned against the wall, her heart racing with adrenaline. Within minutes, the sound of police sirens could be heard outside. Jean opened the door to her apartment and waited anxiously as the police arrived. She led him to the old lady's apartment and watched as they entered the crime scene. The next few hours were a blur of questioning and statements. Jean recounted everything she had seen and heard, trying her best to be as accurate as possible. She couldn't shake the image of the old lady's decomposed body from her mind. As the night wore on, the police finished their investigation and left. Jean was left alone in her apartment, still in shock. She knew it would be a long time before she could forget the gruesome sight she had witnessed. Jean remembered the big picture the old lady hangs on the wall of her apartment. It's a picture of her family, including her son. Jean realized that the old lady had been a happy woman once, surrounded by loved ones. But now, she had died alone and unloved. Weeks had passed since the discovery of the old lady's body. The police investigation had concluded that it was an accident. She had slipped and fallen, which caused her death. It was a tragic end to a lonely life. The son, who was working overseas, finally returned to hold his mother's funeral. Jean went to pay her respects and saw the son weeping with regret. He realized that if only he had visited or called more often, he would not be feeling such deep remorse. Jean felt a sense of sadness too, knowing that the old lady had lived her life alone, without anyone to share it with.